Hi everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about what happens after the war, and in particular I'm going to talk about American involvement in the peace process. Remember, this was the first major European war that the United States had been involved in, and Woodrow Wilson and members that were of his cabinet who were close to him saw this as an opportunity, even as a calling for the United States to bring the success and what was seen as its modern approach to government, its successful approach to government, to European nations, in the hopes that this would be the last great European war. And to this end, Wilson set out what he called his 14-point plan, a plan for lasting peace in Europe. The first points are based around the idea of open diplomacy and respecting neutrality, especially the neutrality at the sea during a conflict, which Wilson had struggled to maintain during World War I. And then when we come to practical efforts, the 14 points involve a division of Europe, especially Eastern Europe, based on the principle of self-determination. Each nation gets to determine their own form of government, or not so much their own form of government, but to govern themselves. And finally, the 14th point, what Wilson saw as one of the most important points, the League of Nations, that there would be an international body that could serve as a tribunal, and so conflicts could be settled peaceably rather than through war. And this was the plan that Wilson hoped to implement in Europe after the end of World War I. However, he made several mistakes. First mistake was that he went to Europe for 6 months to lead the peace delegations. No American president had ever spent this much time outside of the United States. It tied Wilson to the peace process and to the product that came out of the peace process that would have to be ratified by the United States Senate in a way that it was difficult for him to distance himself from this. It made it very much a referendum on him as much as on this treaty. And so he loses touch with his citizens at home in the United States. He's also going to struggle to connect with his counterparts in Europe. At first, he is welcomed to Europe. The Americans are seen as a breath of fresh cultural energy in a continent that has been destroyed through a brutal bloody war, and they're also rightly seen as responsible for ending the war. Nevertheless, Britain and France have their own goals as part of this peace process, and they're much less idealistic than Wilson's. The French are still afraid of the Germans. They want to humiliate Germany, make sure that Germany never poses a threat to them again. And the British want to maintain and to strengthen their global empire. And the problem is that they kind of have Wilson between a rock and a hard place here. If he won't give them what they want, it means that they'll just threaten to withdraw from the League of Nations, and which Wilson sees as central to his peace plan, and so he's forced to keep making concessions to Britain and France. There's a note of fear throughout the conference, the peace process in Paris that will lead to the Treaty of Versailles, and that's a fear of another communist revolution, just like it happened in Russia. Empires of Germany, Austria, and Turkey are in ruins. It's well known that there's a political vacuum there. There's a fear that what happened in Russia could spread to other parts of Europe. Russia had seemed a very unusual place for Marxism to take hold, and so there's a fear that it could happen anywhere, and desire to work quickly, to put something in place to be moving forward, and to seal that vacuum. And so this is what the peace process returns. There's an imposition of democracy led by Wilson, even over areas that perhaps would benefit from a more multicultural traditional approach. So, for example, Eastern Europe, which had been part of the Austro-Hungary Empire for a number of centuries by this point, Wilson rejects maintaining the Habsburg dynasty, the ruling dynasty of this empire, in any form, and insists that this empire has to be broken up into lots of little groups as part of his process of self-determination. Of course, what he finds then is that this idea of self-determination is very fuzzy. What is it that constitutes a nation? Is it a linguistic group? Is it a geographic space? What happens if those two things overlap? And so Eastern Europe is carved up by Wilson and mishmashed back together again, and not in a way that's sustainable, where a political vacuum still exists, where Germany and then Russia are going to be able to impose their will. So this is one of the flaws of Wilson's method. And of course, at the same time, as he's promoting democracy, insisting on democracy in areas of the world that might have been more used to a more traditional monarchy, he is doing nothing about the British Empire. He's even allowing the British Empire to expand in a way that's not democratic at all. And so you have inconsistencies there. Eventually, the peace process is agreed, with Wilson making these concessions to Britain and France. Most notably, what's known as the Guilt Clause, that blames Germany for the war and imposes ruinous reparations on the Germans that makes it very difficult for this peace to be sustainable. What seals the fact that the peace treaty will not succeed is the failure of Wilson to achieve the ratification of the Treaty of Versailles and of the League of Nations at home in the United States. And this is because members of the United States Senate see this as an imposition on the Constitution. That there are requirements for being part of the League of Nations, such as that a country can be commanded by the League of Nations to go to war, to defend a decision that's made by the League of Nations. And in the eyes of enough senators in the United States to block this treaty, that's seen as an overreach of the Constitution. That's seen as a non-American body having influence within their country. And so this reason that the Senate rejects the League of Nations, rejects joining the League of Nations, it rejects ratifying the Versailles Treaty. Wilson tries to turn things around by going on this extensive tour of the United States to try and persuade popular opinion to support him. He goes on this grueling tour across the country, making multiple speeches a day, and he was already in bad health in the first place. And in the end, he suffers a stroke. He goes into decline, so much so that his wife has to help him sign the documents that are necessary while he kind of makes his way through his last months in office. And at this point, the United States never joins the League of Nations, never ratifies the Treaty of Versailles, makes separate peace treaties with Germany and Austria, and this is Wilson's great failure. And Wilson's presidency is this fascinating combination of a highly successful first term of passing progressive legislation, and then an unsuccessful and in the end humiliating second term, in which his plan for securing lasting peace in Europe is an unqualified failure, a failure to redraw the boundaries of Europe, and a failure to establish an organization like the League of Nations that will guarantee this peace.